The thermometer on the motor pool wall had stopped working 3 days ago. It had given up at 51 degrees Celsius and simply melted into a slow amber droop along its lower edge, the mercury bulb gone soft, the number erased. No one replaced it. There was no point in knowing the exact temperature when the temperature was, in every meaningful sense, unsurvivable. Forward Operating Base Kestrel sat on a salt flat 12 kilometers from the Kalat Ridge, a ridge that had no strategic importance to anyone except the two forces currently trying to kill each other across it. The base was a collection of hardened concrete shelters, corrugated blast walls, and a single prefabricated command module that groaned in the wind like an old man trying to stand. The concertina wire along the perimeter had taken on a reddish tint from the iron oxide in the sand, and in the afternoon light, it looked less like a military fortification than the skeleton of something enormous that had lain down and died here. Captain Devon Hargrove had not slept in 36 hours. He stood inside the command module with his hand braced against the wall and his eyes fixed on the situation board, a grid of acetate overlays showing enemy contact reports, friendly positions, and the 3 distinct zones of overlapping fire that his sector intelligence officer had marked in red grease pencil just before dawn. The overlapping zones were the problem. They were always the problem. When the geometry of a firefight produced overlapping zones, you got dead men you couldn't explain in writing. Hargrove was 34 years old. He had a jaw like a railroad tie and a sunburn so severe that the skin on his forearms had begun to crack along the tendons. He was, by any reasonable metric, a competent officer, not brilliant, but steady, the kind of man who remembered call signs and kept his equipment clean and never asked his subordinates to do what he would not do himself. His soldiers respected him. His CO tolerated him. His ex-wife had moved to Portland 3 years ago and sent Christmas cards that she signed only with her first name, Deborah, as though she were already in the process of becoming a stranger. He was also, at this precise moment, losing control of a situation he did not fully understand. The enemy force on the ridge had shifted. They'd been static for 4 days, mortaring the base on a predictable schedule, 2 rounds at 0600, 2 at 1400, then silence. The schedule had made them easier to hate but also easier to plan around. Then this morning the schedule had broken. The mortaring had become continuous, sustained, walking back and forth across the base perimeter in a pattern that suggested not a harassment mission but a preparation, the artillery softening a position before infantry moves. His radar screen was showing contacts. That was the other problem. "Tell me again," he said to Sergeant First Class Lloyd Reardon, who was sitting in front of the radar console with his sleeves rolled past his elbows and his face pale with something that wasn't heat exhaustion. "Multiple dismounts," Reardon said. "Bearing 270 to 310. Range varies. Moving. How many? Can't tell. The clutter is the sands up, sir. The Doppler filter is trying to separate thermal shimmer from actual movement, and it's not doing great. Best guess." Reardon looked at the screen for a long moment. "Between 8 and 40. Hargrove said nothing. 8 was a probe, 40 was an assault. The gap between those two numbers contained every possible decision, and each decision had its own consequences, and some of those consequences were irreversible. Through the blast wall viewport, the afternoon light was the color of old bone. Outside, in the narrow channel between the command module and the vehicle bay, a woman was sweeping. She used a push broom with a fiberglass handle and a head of nylon bristles that had gone gray with embedded sand. She worked in the methodical way of someone who understood that the work would never be truly finished, that the sand would come back the moment she moved on, that the channel would fill again within the hour, and who had made a kind of peace with that understanding. She swept in long, even strokes, redistributing the fine talcum-grade grit toward the edges of the walkway. Her name, according to the laminated badge clipped to her work shirt, was Margaret Ellison, Contractor Services, Base Support. The badge was outdated. The photo on it showed a woman who looked younger and more rested and who was smiling in the thin, cooperative way people smile when told to hold still. The woman doing the sweeping had stopped smiling like that some years ago. She was 41 years old. She had brown hair cut to collar length, pulled back with a rubber band she'd taken from a requisition envelope. She wore tan cargo pants, a long-sleeved shirt despite the heat she'd learned long ago that in this climate, covered skin stayed more functional than exposed skin, and the kind of work boots that came from a military surplus catalog and lasted 10 years if you treated the leather. She was not remarkable to look at. She was, in fact, precisely unremarkable, which was a quality she had cultivated with the same care that other people cultivated visibility. She had been cleaning and maintaining the FOB's non-tactical spaces for 7 months. She had spoken, in those 7 months, perhaps 400 words to the military personnel on base. "Good morning." "Yes, sir. I'll get to it." "Thank you." She ate in the contractor facility and slept in a prefab room the size of a large closet and had, in all that time, made no friends and attracted no particular attention. She was the woman who swept, She was the woman who mopped the latrine block on Tuesday and Thursday mornings and who cleaned the cookware after the evening meal and who replaced the filters in the water coolers on the 1st of every month. The soldiers did not think about her, which was, as far as she was concerned, the correct outcome. She swept. The base shook a mortar round, close, northeast quadrant, probably inside the wire by 30 meters. She did not flinch. She adjusted the angle of her stroke to avoid the small ridge of sand that the blast pressure had pushed across the walkway and continued sweeping. The radio on the communications mast above the command module crackled with something that was not a voice. She paused. Captain Hargrove came out of the command module at 1,547 hours, just as Margaret Ellison was working her way past the entrance. The door opened outward and the edge of it struck the broom handle, which clattered against the blast wall, which made a sound that caused 2 soldiers near the vehicle bay to reach for their weapons before processing the information and standing down. Hargrove looked at the broom. He looked at the woman holding it. His eyes did the thing that eyes sometimes do when they encounter an object that is both expected and inexplicable: a brief recalibration, the brain catching up to the scene. "What are you doing here?" he said. "Sweeping, sir." She picked up the broom. "This is a restricted zone during a contact event. You're supposed to be in the contractor shelter." "Yes, sir." She did not move. Hargrove stared at her. He was running on no sleep and high cortisol and a creeping sense of professional catastrophe, and the sight of a base support contractor standing calmly in the middle of a firefight preparation area with a push broom was doing something to his composure that he did not have adequate resources to address. "Then go there," he said. "I heard something on the radio," she said. The sentence landed with an odd weight, not because of what it contained but because of how it was delivered: quietly, precisely, without the usual upward inflection of a statement disguising itself as a question. It was a report. She was reporting something. Hargrove's intelligence officer, 2nd Lieutenant Patrick Crenshaw, had followed him out of the command module. Crenshaw was 24 years old, from Columbus, Ohio, and had been commissioned 9 months ago after finishing near the top of his military intelligence class. He was smart, rigorous, and deeply, genuinely certain of the limits of what civilians could possibly understand about operational matters. "Sir." "She shouldn't be." "I heard it," Hargrove said to the woman. "We all heard it. It's interference." "It's not interference." The 2 soldiers near the vehicle bay were watching now. Staff Sergeant Travis Beaumont, a compact man from eastern Kentucky who'd been in the Army for 11 years and had developed a fine-grained sensitivity to the moments when a situation became something other than what it appeared, was watching more carefully than the others. Hargrove took a breath. "Ma'am, I need you to move to the contractor facility now." What you heard on the primary tactical net at approximately 15:43 was not radio interference. It was a coded signal, pulse sequence, not voice. Specifically, 3 short, 1 long, 2 short, 1 long, 1 short. She said it the way you say a telephone number you've memorized, with the flat recitative quality of information you have carried so long it no longer has edges. Crenshaw made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Sir, the contacts your radar is showing," she continued, "moving on bearing 270 to 310. They're not hostile. They're sending that signal because they have no other way to identify themselves, and they're hoping someone here recognizes it." Hargrove looked at her for a long moment. "You need to go to the contractor shelter," he said. His voice had a careful quality now, the voice of a man who is managing something and knows he is managing something. "If you fire on those contacts, you will kill American personnel." The word American hit the air and stayed there. "That's a very serious claim," Crenshaw said. "From a base support contractor." She turned her eyes to him slowly. "Yes," she said. "It is." Hargrove went back inside the command module. He told Crenshaw to hold the fire mission that had been requested by his forward element, Sergeant First Class Aaron McAllister's 4-man team, currently dug into a scrape position 200 meters south of the perimeter wire, waiting for authorization to engage the contacts. He told McAllister to hold. McAllister came back on the radio with a flat, one-word acknowledgement that carried the full weight of his opinion. The radar screen showed the contacts continuing to move. They were moving in an unusual pattern, not the straight-line advance of troops in attack formation, not the lateral spread of a flanking movement. They were moving in a broken, irregular pattern. That could have been evasion, and could have been exhaustion, and could have been something else entirely. "What do you know about this signal?" Hargrove asked her. He had allowed Margaret Ellison into the command module. He had done this over Crenshaw's objection, which he had addressed by looking at Crenshaw for approximately 3 seconds without speaking. Crenshaw had stepped back. She was standing near the entrance. She had left the broom outside. "I know what it means," she said. "I know who designed it. I know the circumstances under which it was intended to be used." "Which are?" When a team has lost all primary and secondary communications and is attempting to pass through a defended position without being shot by friendly forces, the signal was designed to be broadcast on the tactical net at a frequency that could be received by standard-issue radio equipment. It was intended to be recognizable to anyone with the relevant training. What relevant training? She was quiet for a moment. It was a classified program, she said. The signal was part of a communications protocol developed for a specific type of cross-border intelligence operation. The protocol was classified at a level above what most tactical commanders would encounter. That's why you don't recognize it. Crenshaw said, "Ma'am, with respect, that's not..." The program was called Cedar Lock, she said. It ran from 2008 to 2011. 11 personnel were assigned to it at peak operations. The last reported operation under Cedar Lock was in the spring of 2011. After that, the program was archived. The personnel files were redacted. The signal protocols were removed from the Standard Communications Reference Library because the program was considered officially concluded. The command module was quiet except for the air handler, which was not doing very much, and the distant percussion of outgoing fire from the base's defensive positions. Beaumont, who had followed them inside without being explicitly invited, said quietly, "How do you know about Cedar Lock?" She looked at him. Something moved across her face. Not quite an expression, more the shadow of one. "I wrote the protocol," she said. In 2009, Margaret Ellison had been Captain Margaret Ellison, Signals Intelligence Analyst, assigned to a unit whose name appeared in no publicly available directory and whose operational footprint was, by design, essentially invisible. She had spent 3 years building communications architecture for small, deep penetration intelligence teams, the kind of teams that operated in places where conventional military presence was either impossible or inadvisable, and whose primary survival mechanism was the capacity to move without being seen and communicate without being heard. The signal protocols she developed were elegant, minimalist, built for degraded conditions. They could be transmitted on any radio with a capable operator. They could be received on any standard receiver. And they were, she had taken considerable care to ensure, difficult to generate accidentally. 3 short, 1 long, 2 short, 1 long, 1 short. That particular sequence, she had chosen it because it was asymmetric in a way that resisted random replication. The probability of a noise event producing that exact pattern across the frequencies used by tactical radio nets was, she had calculated, approximately 1 in 11,000. She had not heard it in 13 years. Cedar Lock had ended badly, not catastrophically, not with casualties, just badly. In the way that programs end when the political calculation that justified them changes and the institutional will to sustain them evaporates. The operation she had supported through most of 2011 had been aborted mid-execution. The teams in the field had been extracted, the files had been sealed. The program had been, in the careful language of the relevant memorandum, administratively concluded. Some of the people who had been assigned to Cedar Lock had transitioned to other programs. Some had left the service. Margaret Ellison had done something else entirely. She had asked for her file to be redacted. This was not a common request, but it was not an unprecedented one. And the circumstances, a concluded program, personnel who had operated under conditions that precluded easy reintegration into normal duty assignments made it administratively manageable. Her separation from service had been processed through a channel that generated minimal paperwork. Her security clearance had been allowed to lapse without fanfare. Her personnel records had been moved to a storage category that required specific authorization to access. She had become, in the eyes of the Army's database architecture, nearly invisible. She had taken the contractor position at FOB Kestrel through a staffing firm that did not ask many questions. She had not sought it out for any particular reason. She had been doing similar work at similar locations for 3 years. It was clean work, in the sense that it required nothing from her except physical presence and a willingness to perform tasks that no one else wanted to perform. She swept floors. She cleaned latrines. She replaced water filters. She listened. She had not planned to do anything with what she heard. She had no agenda, no mission. She was simply, as she had explained to a VA counselor in Phoenix 2 years earlier, trying to stay tethered to something real. The counselor had nodded and made a note and referred her to a psychiatrist who prescribed medication she did not take. The signal on the radio had not been part of any plan. It had simply been there, and she had recognized it, and recognizing it had made a certain sequence of events unavoidable. Hargrove looked at her for a long time after she finished speaking. He was a man who prided himself on maintaining epistemic order, on keeping his assessments calibrated, his assumptions challenged, his conclusions provisional. He had been trained to distrust certainty, to build his operational picture from multiple confirmed sources, to act on evidence rather than intuition. He was, in short, not the kind of man who accepted extraordinary claims from base support contractors at face value. He was also, in the back of his mind, doing arithmetic. The contacts on the radar were moving erratically. The signal on the tactical net was a specific, non-random pulse sequence. The woman in front of him had named a classified program he had never heard of, described a technical architecture that was internally consistent with what she was claiming, and had done all of this with a composure that was either the calm of someone telling the truth or the calm of someone so thoroughly committed to a deception that the distinction had ceased to matter. He looked at Beaumont. Beaumont gave him nothing, which, from Beaumont, was itself a kind of assessment. The radio, Hargrove said, "Play back the sequence from 1543. Reardon pulled up the recording. The room filled with the sound of tactical net audio background noise, wind, the hiss of an open channel, and then, embedded in it, the pulse sequence. Short, long, short, short, long, short. Margaret Ellison closed her eyes. She brought her lips together and she whistled. 3 notes, short. 1 note, long. 2 notes, short. 1 note, long. 1 note, short. The fidelity was imperfect. She was working from memory across 13 years, but the pattern was unmistakable. It was the same sequence. It was the same signal. She opened her eyes. Reardon had turned around in his chair. He was looking at her the way people look at something they cannot categorize. The radio on the primary tactical net crackled. For a moment there was nothing. Then the signal played back, not recorded. Live, from the contacts on the ridge. The room went very still. Hargrove said, quietly, "Who's out there?" The ceasefire order went out at 1,603 hours. It went out on the primary tactical net, on the secondary net, on the battalion administrative frequency, and by runner to McAllister's position in the scrape south of the perimeter. McAllister received the message, confirmed receipt, and said nothing further, which was his method of expressing an opinion. The contacts on the radar continued moving. Now that the fire mission was on hold, their movement resolved into something clearer. They were approaching the perimeter, not in the spread formation of a maneuvering force, but in a cluster, a single irregular mass of bodies moving together. 8 people, possibly 9. Hargrove had put 3 reaction elements on standby at the main gate and the eastern personnel access point. He had briefed them. Challenge, wait for countersign, weapons cold until positive identification. He had also placed Beaumont at the eastern access point, because Beaumont was the person on this base whose judgment he trusted in ambiguous conditions. Margaret Ellison had asked, quietly, if she could stand with the element at the main gate. Hargrove had said yes before he fully understood why. The sun had dropped behind the ridge. The temperature had not changed. The heat here stored itself in the ground and the blast walls and released slowly through the night, and the first hour after sunset was often the hottest of the day in the peculiar way of desert thermodynamics, but the light had changed. The bone-colored afternoon had become something darker and more ambiguous. The sky above the ridgeline still vivid with heat-refracted color while the base itself lay in early shadow. They heard the group before they saw them, feet on gravel, the sound of people who had been walking for a long time and had stopped bothering to be careful about it. Not careless, exactly, but beyond the energy threshold where silence is maintainable. At the gate, the reaction element challenged. There was a pause. Then a voice, rough, dehydrated, careful, gave the correct countersign. Beaumont, at the eastern access point, heard the exchange on his radio and relayed the all clear to the gate element. He did this professionally, without commentary. And then he exhaled very slowly in the dark. There were 9 of them. They came through the main gate in a loose single file, supporting 2 men who were not walking under their own power. They were American. They were also, in several cases, barely this side of whatever threshold separates the functional from the non-functional. 3 of them were suffering from heat injuries that the base medic, Specialist Darcy Holloway, would later describe as among the most severe she had treated in 4 years of service. 2 had gunshot wounds that had been field-dressed with materials that were no longer functioning as dressings. 1 man, tall and broad-shouldered and perhaps 40 years old, had a hand that had been wrapped in cloth torn from someone else's shirt, and the cloth had gone the color of rust. The team leader, a lean, weathered man named Crawford, who had the eyes of someone who had been operating at the edge of human capacity for longer than was recommended, looked around the interior of the base with the expression of a person verifying, moment by moment, that this environment was real. Holloway and her assistant, Private First Class Aaron Sievers, moved immediately. The 2 non-ambulatory men were taken to the aid station. The others were guided to the shade of the vehicle bay, where someone produced water, and someone else produced MREs, and the 9 men sat down on whatever they could find and did the work of still being alive. Crawford was the last one in. He handed his weapon to a soldier at the gate with the careful motion of someone who understood the protocol even when they were too exhausted to speak, and then he turned and looked at the assembled reaction element and then beyond them, and his eyes found Margaret Ellison. He stopped, He looked at her for a long moment, with the particular expression of someone trying to reconcile a present image with a stored one, running the face through a recognition process that had not been accessed in years. "Margaret," he said. It was not a question. "Hello, Daniel," she said. Captain Hargrove assembled the facts in the order they arrived. Crawford's team had been inserted 9 days ago under a mission compartment that Hargrove did not have access to and would not be given access to. Their primary communications had failed on day 2, a combination of equipment damage and an adversarial signal suppression effort that was more sophisticated than anticipated. Their backup communications had failed on day 5. They had been moving toward the pre-designated extraction corridor for 4 days, moving at night, going to ground during the day, rationing their remaining water against a timeline that had been revised continuously and downward. The signal protocol, the Cedar Lock Pulse sequence, had been included in their Mission Essential Communications reference as a legacy fallback option. It had been included because someone in the mission planning process had been thorough enough to pull historical documentation from the archived records, and the archived records had contained, in a section labeled Obsolete Protocols, the Cedar Lock sequence with the notation, for use only when all primary and secondary comms have failed and CASVAC is required. Crawford had transmitted it 4 times over 24 hours. He had not expected anyone to recognize it. Hargrove looked at this information. Then he looked at the woman who had recognized it. He understood, now, at least the surface of what he was dealing with. He did not ask for the depth, some professional instinct, not obstruction, not incuriosity, but a kind of situational prudence told him that the depth would require authorizations he did not currently hold, and that the more pressing obligation was to the 9 men who had come through his gate. He did, however, ask one question. "The program," he said. "Cedar Lock. Why did you leave?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the command module's small viewport, he could see the vehicle bay, where Crawford and his team were sitting in the intermittent light of a fuel lantern. Someone had found blankets. Someone else had found additional water. The tableau had the quality of an aftermath, not victory, not failure. Just the strange, ordinary business of people returning from somewhere they should not have had to go. "The last operation," she said. "In 2011, I was the signals architect. I was responsible for the communications infrastructure that was supposed to keep the teams in contact with each other and with their handlers. The infrastructure failed, not because of equipment, not because of adversarial action." She paused. "Because of a decision made at a level above me, without my input, that changed the operational parameters without updating the communications architecture. What happened? 2 men on the team were exposed. They spent 11 days unable to identify themselves to any friendly element because the updated protocols hadn't been distributed. They survived, but the mechanism that should have protected them didn't work, because the program's administration had decided that updating the communications protocols was a lower priority than executing the operational change." Hargrove said nothing. "I requested an investigation," she said. The investigation produced a finding that the communications failure was consistent with accepted operational risk. I disagreed with that finding. I continued to disagree with it through several formal channels. Eventually, it became clear that the most functional thing I could do was to stop being the kind of person who made that kind of disagreement, or stop being associated with the institutional context in which the disagreement was happening. "So you left?" I asked for my file to be redacted. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. "And then you started sweeping floors. There's a particular kind of clarity," she said carefully, "in doing work that is necessary and legible and does not require you to make decisions that other people will die because of. I find it valuable." Hargrove had a report to write. He would write it that night, by lamplight, in the spare and specific language of an after-action summary, and he would include in it the sequence of events that had led to the identification of the friendly contacts, and he would describe the cessation of hostilities, and he would note the recovery of 9 personnel, including 2 requiring medical evacuation, and he would file the report through the chain of command, and the chain of command would process it, and it would become part of the permanent record of FOB Kestrel's operations. He would not write certain things. He would not write that he had been, for approximately 45 minutes, preparing to authorize a fire mission that would have killed at least some of Crawford's team. He would not write that the outcome had depended on the recognition of a classified communications protocol by a base support contractor who had deliberately erased herself from the institutional memory that should have known to include, here. He would not write that the gap between what the Army's documentation systems contained and what the Army's people had actually built and understood was large enough that a woman sweeping floors on a forward operating base in a 5-1-degree desert had been the only person present who could close it. He did write one thing that was not strictly required. In the section labeled Personnel Contributing to Positive Outcome, he included the name Margaret Ellison, Contractor Services, and the notation, Subject Recognized Legacy Signals Protocol from Cedar Lock Program. Archive 2011, and correctly identified inbound personnel as friendly. Recommendation: review of archived signals documentation for protocols currently in use by operating forces. He stared at that last sentence for a while. Then he filed the report. The helicopter came at 0600. It came in low over the ridge, running fast, flaring hard above the landing pad that the base's engineers had scraped out of the salt flat east of the perimeter. It took Crawford's two most seriously injured personnel and lifted off again without ceremony, banking south and quickly becoming a sound and then a nothing. Crawford himself was medically cleared for transport but operationally functional, and he spent the early morning in quiet conversation with Hargrove in the shade of the vehicle bay. Margaret Ellison did not participate in this conversation. She was, at the time of the helicopter's arrival, cleaning the latrines in the contractor facility, which was her Tuesday morning assignment. At 0730, she emerged from the contractor facility with a mop and a bucket and began working her way along the eastern corridor of the base. She heard footsteps on the gravel behind her. She did not turn around. "My CO is going to want to speak with you," Hargrove said. "I understand. There will likely be people above my CO who want to speak with you as well. I understand that too." She moved the mop in a long, even stroke. "You could come back," he said, not pressingly. "The way you say a thing when you think the thing is true but aren't certain of the ethics of saying it. The program is over, but the work isn't. Someone who understands what you understand." "Captain Hargrove." He stopped. She straightened up. She looked at him directly, which she had not done very often, and when she did, he saw something in her face that he recognized not as a military expression, but as the expression of someone who has made a considered, permanent decision and is at peace with the making of it, and who does not require anyone else's understanding of that decision in order to maintain the peace. "Yesterday afternoon, 9 men came through that gate alive. That is a real thing. It exists in the world. It will continue to exist regardless of what I do next, or what I'm called, or what file my name appears in." She picked up the bucket. "That's sufficient," she said. "For me, that's sufficient." She went back to work. Hargrove stood in the corridor for a moment. The base around him was resuming its morning operations, the vehicle bay crew beginning their maintenance checks, the kitchen detail moving through the cookhouse, someone on the roof of the command module testing a radio, the sounds of a place that was, for the time being, functional. He turned and went back to write his second report of the morning. Beaumont found Crawford near the vehicle bay at 0800, where Crawford was sitting with his back against a blast wall, eating an MRE with the unhurried focus of a man whose appetite has returned after a long absence. "You know her," Beaumont said, not accusatory, just placing it. Crawford looked up. "Long time ago. She good people?" Crawford ate another spoonful of something labeled chicken with noodles and thought about the question with more seriousness than it perhaps required. He thought about 2009 and a conference room in a building whose address he still couldn't name, and a woman with a whiteboard covered in signal architecture diagrams who had explained patiently and precisely why the protocol she was designing was less likely to fail than the one it was replacing, and how she had been right about that, and right about other things afterward, and what it had cost her to keep being right in an institutional environment that found rightness inconvenient. "Yeah," he said. "She's good people." Beaumont nodded. He looked across the base toward the eastern corridor, where the sound of a mop and bucket was moving steadily away from them. "Funny thing to do," he said. "Sweeping floors." Crawford looked down at his MRE. "Not really," he said. "When you think about it." The sun came up over the Kalat Ridge and turned the salt flat white. The radar screen in the command module showed nothing of concern. McAllister's team, recalled from the scrape position at 0530, was eating breakfast and not speaking to anyone about their feelings. The water coolers along the contractor facility corridor had been refilled, and the filters checked last week, still good for another 10 days, were doing their job in the quiet, invisible way that filters do. In the narrow channel between the command module and the vehicle bay, the sand had blown back overnight. A thin gray layer of it covered the concrete. Margaret Ellison swept it toward the edges in long, even strokes. She worked from north to south, and when she reached the southern end of the channel, she turned and looked back at what she had done, the clean path, the edges banked with their neat ridges of displaced grit, and then she turned again and went to find the dustpan. There are people who build the architecture of entire wars and leave no record behind that anyone can find. There are people who choose the broom over the battle plan not because the broom is lesser, but because the broom is honest, and the path it clears is real, and when you push it in front of you, it does not ask you to decide who lives and who doesn't. There are things that once you have built, will call to you across years and distance and silence, and you will recognize them when you hear them again. And in that moment of recognition, that single, precise, unrepeatable moment, you will be, once more, exactly what you were, and then you will go back to work.